Thank you. So yes, I'm currently at and have always been at, the University of Waikato, Te Whare Wānanga Waikato. And one of the first things that happens to a new staff member at the university is that we're put on an induction training to teach us how to say the name of the university. The work that I'm going to be talking about is a very brief and general overview of a series of studies that I've been working on since the early 2000s. This is just a sampling, and my purpose is to try to talk through some of the big changes that have been occurring with how people interact with their own personal music collections. But first, for a little bit of background, I work in New Zealand, properly put here at the top center. And as you can see, it is very far from anything else. New Zealanders fondly refer to it as the last bus stop on the planet. That does have some impact on the types of behaviors that people will have with their music collections. New Zealand isn't quite as well connected as the rest of the planet, not even that well connected to the planet. But also New Zealand is very much a first world country, and also they're very, very keen first adopters of any technology that comes along. It is a country that has mainly had its financial base in agriculture, but it's not the person pulling a plow in the rice paddy sort of agriculture. They've very much been investing in the top technology from the inception of the country as a separate nation. Well, that's where I come from physically. Where I come from professionally, just to give you a bit of my personal background. Way back in the 80s, I got my bachelor degrees at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. I do have a bachelor's of computer science. I also earned a bachelor's in the humanities. Then I went on to Louisiana State and earned my PhD in computer science. You're required were at the time at LSU, to earn a minor subject to do master's level work in something other than what you're getting your PhD in. I chose Chinese history. They laughed and said, no, it had to be a real subject. And, literally. But I persevered with that and also ended up with a minor in library science. This was purely serendipitously. I chose that because the library science department was in the same building on the same floor, so they were easy to get at. But also they seemed very cheerful. And so that gave me quite a bit of background in addition to my computing background. So when I joined Waikato University in 1990, I did indeed start out in what they call the more hardcore end of computer science, mainly artificial intelligence and machine learning. Then a small digital libraries group was formed, and then later on a small HCI group. I joined those, and my research focus gradually moved on to digital libraries, information science, information behavior, and particularly in music, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So that's basically to tell you what my original mindset was when I started getting into this music behavior sort of thing. My original intellectual mindset was very much out of computer science, specifically out of the information retrieval community. And information retrieval is very much concerned with efficiency and effectiveness. How much can we compress the text? How fast can we uncompress it? How fast can we run the searches? How precise are the retrieval sets? What kind of recall do we get? It's all very much what I've come to think of as the sort of surgical strike conception metaphor for how people interact with retrieval systems. The idea is that I know what I want, I get in, I grab it, I get out, and nobody's hurt. So again, just to give you a little bit of an overview of what you're going to hear for the next half hour or so, my music-related interests in regards to music behavior and music digital libraries, I've mainly been trying to work with people who like music, what the anthropologists call in the wild. So rather than doing lab-based studies, I'm trying to look at authentic behavior, what it is that people actually are doing and want to do. I've been trying to build a really rich picture of various types of music-related behavior, how people locate music, how they discover new music, what it is that they do with their music, how it is that they use it, how they organize music, both in the public collection and in a private collection. And I've been particularly interested in collaborative behavior, what people do with music together. Again, I tend to work mainly with, I'm sorry, I couldn't come up with a better phrase than this, regular people, rather than studying what music professionals do or music academics do. Not that you people aren't interesting as well, it's just that there's just so much rich behavior in all the other people in the world. And so my head of department asks me this sometimes, what is the point in a computer science department for doing this sort of work? Well, the point is trying to come up with insights from this behavior that's actionable, that can suggest more formal studies for other researchers in this area, or that can be used to inform the design of new music systems. So to start you on the whirlwind trip, the first music-related study that I did was the one Audrey talked about, looking at how people shop for music. And the motivation for this was that I wanted to know what it was that people do when they interact with large music collections. And it suddenly occurred to me one day that the easiest way to do that was to look at what people did in a music store, because those are large, publicly available collections, and they certainly seem to have a lot of use at that time. So again, just to set the scene a little bit for the sort of technological environment that there was in the early 2000s, people had mainly moved on to digital music, mainly on physical CDs. The CDs, people played on their formal CD players in their living rooms, or perhaps on a Walkman, or if they had a computer that was fitted out with some nice speakers, they could listen to their music in their office as well. Now, Napster and other peer-to-peer sharing systems were accessible in New Zealand, but not really used for large-scale music downloads. So the problem with New Zealand at that time was that fewer people had internet access at home. The internet access was hideously expensive. It was mainly dial-up, and so also hideously slow. So trying to do this sort of downloading of large amounts of music was just not cost-effective. It was often actually cheaper just to go and buy the CD. Also, if you did have music on a CD, a lot of it stayed on a CD, except for certain selected songs, because trying to save to a CD-ROM, trying to create your own CD-ROM required expensive hardware. If you were going to download a lot of stuff and try to save it on your hard drive, then that would quickly mean that you didn't have room for anything else on your hard drive. And also, there was still some social stigma for being seen with bootleg music. So going into this, of course, it did the nice little literature review. And what I found was mainly the previous music behavior investigations, most, not all, of course, were either lab experiments where there were very specific questions that were being asked. You know, what parts of a song do people remember most accurately? What metadata about songs do people remember? That sort of thing. Or there were looks at how people used music libraries in the form of looking through music reference logs. Again, really interesting, but music libraries tend to have different types of music than your average person has access to or wants to access on a regular basis. But there was also a lot of anecdotal bits talked about, particularly in groups of people who were trying to develop music retrieval systems. One of the big anecdotes was that people don't know the name of the song, excuse me, but they can hum a few bars, and so that's the important thing, helping people to hum a few bars and find that song. So again, I started out wanting to know how people search for music in large public music collections. So my method, straight out of anthropology, anonymous participant observations. Myself and a colleague in the UK spent a lot of time hanging around in music stores watching what people did. Some accompanied shopping. I got some people to allow me to go with them, and they did the talk aloud thing while they shopped for music. My partner in the UK organized some focus groups, and really important, if you've never done this sort of research, it's really important that you do what's called triangulation, that you don't just trust the first method that you use. You don't try to trust just one way of viewing the data. So our triangulation was through the mixed methods, the different ways of trying to see what was going on in the music stores, and also by two different collaborating researchers having a look at this data. So first things we found out were, kind of boring, kind of what we would have expected to find out. That yes, metadata is important, that there are people who want to do known item searches, but they can't quite remember the correct title of the song or the name of the artist, yada, yada, yada. Yes, lyrics, searching by lyrics is good. All sorts of things. Again, if I'd asked you to sit there and think about what it is that people might want to know if they searched for music, you could have come up with this. This one was a little bit surprising to us, but led on to other interesting avenues of research, that yes, people were not only interested in finding out stuff about the music, not only interested in finding the music, but also interested in finding out more about the context of the music. So that's really interesting for trying to develop sort of full-bodied music systems, is thinking beyond just the music files, just the song. What really expanded our minds was when we realized that, okay, we'd really been having too narrow a focus when we were thinking about this, when we were designing that study. We were thinking about how people search for music. But it turned out that browsing was a really, really significant activity. I delved into the theory of shopping, and yes, there is a theory of shopping. And it turns out that music shopping is what they call shopping around, not shopping for. That the sort of search and retrieval systems are set up for shopping for going in and finding the thing that you need and then getting back out. Shopping around is the idea of enjoying the process. And maybe you find something that you want, maybe you don't, but that process was actually much of the reason that you were there doing it. And also discovered that this searching and browsing were often interleaved. Someone would browse for something that would remind them that there's this other thing they wanted. When they found that, oh, there's something interesting over here. So yeah, a lot of serendipity, just a very, very rich set of behaviors that we hadn't expected when we went in with that very narrow conception of what it was we were looking for. We also discovered that music shopping is really visual, that there's the cover art that's used for browsing, that's used to find the correct part of the store, that's used as a clue to the contents. One person held up a CD and said, "What would this sound like?" And, also really significantly as a tool for collaborative shopping. You've got this thing that you can talk about, that you can show, that you can interact with another person. And that was the other really big insight, that music shopping is collaborative, that people would plan trips with somebody else to go to the music store, or more frequently, we could see people who were out at the shops near the music store. They'd be walking along. Oh, that's a nice display. They'd get a little closer, and then suddenly they were all sucked into the orbit of the music store. It's also shopping for someone else, a way of showing your connection to someone, showing that you know their tastes, being able to pick something up and know whether or not this is something that other person would respond to. So it was a really lovely way of bonding together as a family, as friends, as a couple, over this music. So my continuing takeaways from that was that, people do want and need the standard music metadata. That is a good thing. That absolutely has to be there. But also that they enjoy looking through that metadata. They enjoy looking through the stuff and seeing the interesting bits of that music. We saw that browsing is as fundamental as searching, and also that it's enjoyable. That surgical strike metaphor is one way to approach music, and certainly sometimes that is the important thing, but also there is that extra layer of just sheer enjoyment that's enhanced when you can share that experience with somebody else. So the next step then, now that we'd had a look at how it is that people interact with the large collections, how they find the music that they wanted to put into their own collections, was to look at what it is that people did with their own personal music collections. So again, methodology. This time we had a bunch of students. So the students, 10 of them, created autoethnographies of their own personal music behaviors. Then they did the same thing, interviews and observations of a friend, 10 of those. We had 3 additional focus groups, and then I went out and did some interviews on my own, 14 of them, and I put this down, the total number of pages, because if you've never done this sort of research before, that doesn't look like much. 20, 34 interviews, you do an hour an interview, that's less than a week. How did you spend all of that time, Sally Jo? But it's actually really time-consuming, because not only do you have to do these interviews, read the audio ethnographies, but then, I don't have to justify myself to you people, I see that. And again, we were very careful to do the triangulation by the methods and by the researchers, and also in this case, by having 10 different students collecting up the autoethnographies for us, so that it wasn't just constrained with one way of looking at this sort of behavior. Okay, so, all right, the students are creating their autoethnographies, they're interviewing other people, I'm interviewing people. One of the first and most obvious questions is, okay, tell me about your collection, your music collection, how big is it? And, came in a range of sizes from one CD. It was a 12-year-old who had her very first CD, and she organized the heck out of that CD. Up to 700 plus CDs, to the point where, that guy really didn't have much of an idea. Range of media. You see the legacy formats. They're still kept around. I'll talk about that in a second. The main thing was CDs that were purchased or compiled, and then a selection of MP3s that were ripped and put onto their desktop machine at work, and so forth. So, one of the first hints of coming trouble that we saw was how very, very distributed personal music collections were, even at that time. that there would be your primary listening device, your secondary listening devices, the Walkman, the desktop machine, things that you carried around with you, things that you kept in various places, your archival collection that you didn't listen to but you still wanted to keep hold of. The collection was in various levels of granularity, some of them full CDs, a few of them just songs ripped from different albums. And so, basically you needed a lot of forward planning to get your music in the right spot at the right time. There were two main ways of organizing the music. One was the frequent listening stack, where you had the stack of CDs that you were listening to the most right now. And that would usually be near the main listening device, and it was very much just play something, put it on top. There was a reported thrashing and sickness cycle where someone would get a CD and then play it to death until they were sick of it, and then move it from this frequent listening stack into the main collection, and then sometimes back and forth. And mainly this frequent listening stack was pruned when it got really tall and it fell over and made a mess. So the main collection was where people put a lot more effort into formally organizing things. And the ways that they organized the collection very much depended on their personal preferences. Sometimes it was just strictly by date of purchase or the last time I listened to it. Some people put in a lot of effort to order by genres, most to least favorite, all that sort of thing. And then, of course, the archival collection. There were these collections of old cassette tapes, old vinyl records, things that people didn't listen to anymore, or in some cases couldn't listen to anymore. They didn't even have the devices to play them. But, two reasons, and you'll see this coming up again later on, two reasons to keep it all. First is inertia. It's really hard work to try to sort through stuff, and not much good to be gained from it. But also, these things had often some real emotional attachments. These were their mementos of the time that they bought this and what they did when they played that at the party. So a lot of strong attachments that meant people kept the physical artifacts long after they stopped actually listening to them. Okay, and again, I'm going to whiz along here, but there was also a really nice set of personal genres that people had developed, where they would mainly develop stacks of CDs, entire albums, but sometimes, occasionally, they'd make a compilation album to fit this genre. And the genres were often by use. I need programming music, or I need relaxation music, or my personal favorite, detention music, to make sure that those high school kids never ever want to sit detention with me again. And this was also, again, most of the people that I studied worked with were either students or young professionals who were flatting together, perhaps some romantic couples and the occasional family. These people often shared access to their collections. There would be a CD player in the living room, and everyone would have their CDs, or at least the ones they were willing to share, sitting there by the shared CD player. Or there would be perhaps a LAN. No, that's later on. So mainly the shared CDs. And the really interesting thing about these collections was that because they were physical, they were also, in a way, a representation of the people, and a way to invite people to see different aspects of the collection owner's life. So it would be a big deal to have a guest come over and, oh yes, we should play some music. You can pick from my collection, 700 CDs, It's still a bit of stress, that, some people would just come over and start moving CDs around. Or even worse, they might ask to borrow the CD. But yes, also just this real sense from many people about how the way that they organize their collection, what they make visible, is going to affect the way that people see them. That in particular, they would try to set things up so that the best CDs, the most impressive ones, the ones that other people would approve of, were at eye level or were in the part of the rack that was visible. And then other CDs, like Chris Isaak, for example, you might have hidden away in another part of the room, or perhaps on the back of the CD rack. Okay, so I just said that there were these visible collections, and for some people, this really didn't make that much of a difference how it was laid out. But for other people, it really, really did. There was the neatness, the care that you took in curating this collection, in making it appeal to people. There was also very much the sense of the tactile appeal, that you didn't just go and look at somebody's CD collection, you would pull a CD out and look at it and put it back. I mean, you could see the CD right there. You're not gaining much by touching it. But there was that just irresistible need to touch the things. And in fact, as more than one person noted that, they'd buy a fancy CD or something that they knew other people would really want, and take it around, maybe let them touch it. And again, many people went to a lot of effort personalizing their CDs, personalizing the appearance of their music. And so my continuing takeaways from that bit of research was that, there was a little bit of tension between music for use, the playlists that you played just to set the mood, or just to make the hip-hop students upset and concerned, and then that deeper engagement with music. And this was just a sort of a glimmering back then. I'll return to that in a few minutes. But also, we could definitely see that people wanted to work with their music collection. They wanted to get in, to organize it, to feel with it, to personalize it, to be able to browse and to just enjoy playing with, literally, the collection. We also noticed that there were some attempts, mainly with the archival collection, to try to build up their personal history with the music. When they bought it, parties that they played it at. And that sort of behavior still isn't very well at all supported by most music systems. Okay, so now we get to the mid-2000s. First thing from 2006, finding new music and creating playlists. So this is two different studies that weren't specifically on people working with their personal music collections, to organize it, but thinking about how it is that they got new music into their collection, how they found it, and then one of the more intensive ways of working with that collection afterwards, the working with playlists. So again, to set the scene, mid-2000s, there were other storage devices besides the floppies. USBs were available, but they were so expensive. The first one that I bought was a small at the time it was a massive 256 meg drive, and it cost what would be about 2 weeks of a student's board and rent. So most students didn't have that sort of thing. On the other hand, CD-ROM burners were readily available. Downloading was still unfortunately expensive, and really slow, and the ISPs were enforcing very strict data caps that were very easy to hit. And it was one of those things at the time, if you went over the cap, then suddenly you might be liable for hundreds of dollars worth of downloads. CDs were still available in stores, but definitely music was moving more and more online. Hard drives were larger, though, and MP3 players were popular. So there was that aspect for having larger amounts of digital music available with you. So what I did here was I did a reevaluation of some earlier studies that were very much focused on finding novel music and how people create mixes and playlists. And I went back through it and looked at it more along the lines of what it is that people actually did to get it into their collection and how they used it once the music was in their collection. So, yeah, one of the really interesting things was how significant personal recommendations were at the time for trying to identify new music that you were going to acquire for your collection. That friends are a starting place for locating the music that I'll obtain. Another person went into a lot of detail about how people would get together. Of course, there'd be music playing, but it wasn't just in the background often that they would be, quote, warning each other about music. Oh, no, don't buy that one, it's terrible. Or giving each other advice about where they could purchase the music by spending the least amount of money, what's on sale and where and when. There was more indirect sorts of recommendations that they might see somebody else's music list showing the music that he's listening to. And so you could see that, you could ask people for more information about that specific music. It was still possible to look through a friend's music collection, again, to go over and to see the music that person has. Interestingly, there were a lot of wireless LANs set up at that point, and that allowed people to see each other's digital collections. But, oh my heavens, the interfaces were just so impoverished. It was so difficult to actually figure out what those songs were, what those files were. And yeah, so it was very awkward and not actually really a good way to find specific types of music. Okay, acquiring music, again, still mainly by album instead of by song. But if you're, again, trying to acquire music, whether you're purchasing it or whether you're going to download it, is still quite a bit of an investment. So you didn't just go out and start downloading stuff. They actually went to quite a bit of trouble researching less familiar music, things that didn't come with a personal recommendation. So that would involve looking at other people's, at artists' websites, however you could find out about the music, then going to something like Amazon's and iTunes and listening to just little clips of the music. Okay, there was some sharing across LANs, a lot of sharing with friends, a lot of sharing URLs or exchanging CD-ROMs, because if it was just too expensive, again, to try to send someone a file or to try to upload something for somebody else to download. The students reported that they did little illegal downloading, and again, I believe them, because once I worked out some of the costs, it's not really cost-effective. It wasn't really cost-effective at that time to download very much. And here, again, really interestingly, the lack of storage really limited the collection size. You had to think about the music that you were acquiring. You had to think about whether or not you wanted to keep it. Okay, so that's a general sort of thing for how they got music into their collections. I'll whiz you right through some of the bits about what it is that they did with it in the form of mixes. This is really interesting because it's one of the most intensive ways that people worked with their music. That they came up with these mixes that were either for their own pleasure or more commonly as a gift for somebody else. They had a wide variety of themes, so this isn't something that you could just look up and find somebody else had done it for you often. There were a lot of rules, many of them unspoken, about how best to put these things together. And again, really importantly, this is something to be shared. This is a collaboration. This is something to give to somebody else. So they went to a huge amount of trouble to ensure that this thing was as meaningful as possible and adding as much personal metadata as possible to remind that person of why this music is shared between the two of them. So my continuing takeaways from that is that at this point, again, music acquisition continues to have to be deliberate, that you have to have a fair amount of familiarity with your own collection and with the music that's out there to acquire music into your own collection. Human recommendations, particularly people that you know, people around you, continue to be important. And that this sort of behavior, this sort of working with your own collection, and particularly mixed construction, required an awful lot of engagement with your own collection to be able to accomplish anything, really. Okay, so finally, I am scooting to the end here. The last study was conducted in 2016, where we revisited the idea of how do people interact with their own personal music collections. Again, setting the scene here, 2016, digital storage is everywhere. Really, really cheap. Even the students can afford it. Digital space is no problem. The New Zealand ISPs still have a cap on downloads, but most of them have made a streaming service free as a part of connecting with that ISP, and streaming music doesn't affect your data cap. Most New Zealanders have broadband at home, a mighty 100 megabytes per second, and most New Zealanders have 3G mobile phones to use those music streaming services. Again, we went through the self-interviews and self-observations with the students, and this time yielding 154 pages of summaries. And the first straightforward, we thought, question that the students asked was, what is the size of your collection? And then we had to regroup because the students just found that incomprehensible. What is the size of your collection? Okay, so looking at where they have their collections or how they access their collections, okay, poof, the students were right. It's all over the place now. Some people had extensive amounts of MP3 files. Some people used a lot of streaming services, used different streaming services. Some people still had things on different media. And most people had a combination of all of the above. Okay, passing through that. All right, so, okay, we thought, let's look at the MP3 collections, and then let's look at the way that people use the streaming services. Well, MP3 collections, wow, you have to be really dedicated anymore to work with an MP3 collection. That, you want it to be a collection, so you have to have all of the metadata, you have to have associated cover art, you have to have it organized in specific ways, but that is difficult, particularly if you're trying to really curate your collection and to work with playlists and to work at a finer grain level than just the metadata that's handed to you when you acquire the MP3 files. So one of the most dedicated people talks here in the last quote about how he has 6,000 songs, and 3 times a year, at least, he goes through his entire collection for each playlist to make sure it's up to date. So that takes 2 weeks, and he does this 3 or more times a year. Okay, so yeah, he was exceptionally dedicated. Most other people with MP3 file collections ran into what's called the shoebox problem when you look at photos, that everybody starts out with great intentions, that first couple sets of photos or music acquisitions are all perfectly organized, you fall behind, everything gets stuffed into a shoebox, and eventually you give up on it. And so yes, many of the students did have external hard drives full of thousands of music files that they never listened to, they didn't even know what was on it. It was just too much to deal with. Again, when we looked at how people actually manage their collections, playlists are still very much the thing. In fact, playlists are now the thing. Nice to discover that most people had a favorites playlist that sounded in its management and its construction pretty much exactly like the old stack of CDs by the CD player. Really interesting was how easy people just talked about how it was to find new music. They no longer had to research the music. They no longer had to ask friends for recommendations, although they could. That there were things like Spotify's Discover that, and these are my emphasis, with very little hassle or research, they can get all the music that's just suitable to them, that turns out that they really like. The downside that several people reported on was then they get bored quickly with some music and have to go on to the next. And so music sharing has become a lot less personal. That the students really didn't talk about anything much in the way of direct sharing of music files, certainly not going to all the trouble of a mixtape. But a lot of the sharing was sometimes actively through sharing playlists or making their own playlists, creating joint playlists with somebody else. A lot of it was very passively. And in fact, several of the students talked about how they really didn't feel comfortable in sharing their own personal playlists because, again, people will judge them on their music tastes and what it is that they're seen to listen to. So, and to conclude, and I am concluding here, that all of this in this very last study really made us question what it is that makes a collection, a personal collection. What is it that makes a song mine? So in the student's mind, clearly owning the physical media makes it mine. That goes for ownership. Having the file, a digital file, that makes it mine if I invest time in it to curate it. Then we start getting over to the streaming services. Well, okay, on the streaming service, anything could be mine. Is it mine if I have continuous access to it? Is it mine if I keep my subscription up with that service? Yeah, and then the students started thinking more deeply about their streaming playlists, that it's really easy for songs to enter a playlist, to leave, for a playlist to get really large, and then for them to never even look at it again. And they said some really intense things about how this sort of streaming thing really does away with their emotional attachment to a lot of music. And it also encourages novelty seeking. I've run out of music to listen to. There's not being songs released as fast enough for me to continue to listen to the music or to manage it. But then, so it's that personal engagement, that personal time and emotion invested in it. What makes it mine is when I've heard a song a couple of times, or enough times that I consciously think, I like this song, I want to listen to it again, and only then will I save it to my Spotify, my hard disk, and then I'll call it mine. So my continuing takeaways from all of that is that, wow, streaming has really introduced a sea change in the way that people not only listen to their music, but how they engage with it, what it means to them. And clearly, ownership isn't the key concept anymore for what makes music mine, what makes my collection. That it's more now on my engagement with it, how much time, how much effort that I spend working with that collection, what it is that I know about it. And in fact, yeah, I hate to say it as someone who works in HCI, but we have possibly done people a bit of a disservice by making it too easy to use these music systems. That if we make it so simple that they don't have to engage with it, then they're not engaging with not only with the system, but they're not engaging with the music as much either. So, okay, I'm sorry I've gone over time, but I think we've got time for a couple of questions.